changing the domino effect. You know, this is a good role we play. Let's go to your program because we have so many ideas to discuss with you.
I've enjoyed. You know, you're such a nice guy. It's kind of like, wow, I don't get. Usually, somebody's half hostile. So, anyway, what do you want to talk about?
Well, you have a good overview of your propertarianism program or propertarian program. So let's go to this through these points.
Let me give a context to start. I always want to. I find that it helps a lot. I was watching the news back in the 90s, early 90s, maybe late 80s. And the Democrats came out with the Marxist strategy, Linsky strategy. It was called talking points. And that is to get on camera, never answer any question, just repeat the talking points. In other words, use it as a commercial. And this is where when our news system broke, is because of that. That's why we broke into the CNN, NBC, and the Fox News and other media. Because there was no way to handle that strategy, which is to avoid discourse, right? It's completely avoided. And so the right wing went to, we're going to have discourse whether you like it or not, or you're not getting airtime. And the left had to then react to it, right? And so then we got the bifurcated news cycle. Anyway, at this time, I was extremely aware of the failure of Europeans to defend their tradition. And I was extremely aware of why that was the case. We don't have a book. We have a legal tradition, a military tradition, a philosophical tradition, and a religious tradition. Right? Right? And then right in the middle is science. And so we have these 5 competing traditions because in our civilization it's based on adversarialism, markets. It's based on the prevention of anyone having power. So you have these 5 traditions competing, right? And so there's no book. However, that's an intellectual position. In reality, everybody lives by the law. So what's consistent over Western civilization throughout time is what matters in everyday life is our law, and our law has been consistent for 4,000 years. Right? So it's our whole strategy is not in our mythology or our religion or in our philosophy. They're sort of reflections of that strategy. They're the strategies in the law, which is individual sovereignty. In other words, every man's his own country. And so what happens is over time, this law remains very constant, but all these powers shift around like this, trying to jockey for power with the other intellectual traditions. All right, so now that you got that, I was trying to say, okay, how do I provide a value-neutral language of ethics and politics? And so I set out originally to do nothing other than make it possible for Europeans to explain their group evolutionary strategy, which was in their law, and it was reflected in a little bit in each of these traditions, so that they would understand what it is they valued. Because all you heard was shallow, simpleton moralizing, right? Oh, it's good, it's moral, it's our tradition. I mean, that doesn't make an argument. And so that's what I set out to do. And that was probably an okay thing, because nobody would set out to do what I've done with P law, proprietarian law. Nobody would do that. You'd have to be crazy. You'd have to even be crazy to envision it was possible. So what happened is I got through the first iteration of understanding what the strategy was, and I understood that the problem of deceit was the problem of the 19th and 20th centuries, and still today, is the introduction of deceit into Western civilization's testimonial truth before face, regardless of cross. And that this was made possible by the scientific industrial revolution and the ability to industrialize propaganda. So now I had to solve the problem of how do I make a law that makes it impossible to lie if we don't know what truth is.
Mm-hmm.
It's the hardest problem in philosophical systems. So I set out to solve that problem, and it took me a while, but I mean, honestly, I figured it out in about a year. It was actually quite difficult. Ethics wasn't too hard. Truth was pretty hard, and the grammar, so in other words, the strict construction of that language is a formal logic that was really hard, right? And then to take that to tie back to your mythology, to tie that back to religion, that's the hardest problem in social science because it's precognitive. And so, I had to solve this series of problems. And then the end result was, how would I protect my civilization? And that would be with a constitution that laid out this group strategy, this body of law, as essentially a Bible, right? A work that was the canon that collapsed all of European civilization's tradition into a body of law and provided all the explanations. Now, again, no sane person would set out to do that. It's just following the problem step by step to reach it. So
you have a pretty good definition on your website that propertarianism consists of the completion of a scientific method and its application to the totality of the human knowledge. And this is actually a good sentence to start with, the completion of the scientific method. Would you elucidate how your approach?
We always, math gets invented, and it's sort of like magic to these people, right? If you go back in time, they talk about math as if it's on borderline magic, right? And the problem is math is, and so when we talk about now let's step back and say morality. When we argue with each other, we justify our actions. We say it's okay. Math came along, and the way they learned math was proof, justification. But those two things affected everything else. We kept looking for justification to explain why. Well, it turns out, in the 20th century, we figure out that's actually not how truth works at all. It doesn't matter how you got there. All that matters is you can warranty by your due diligence that it's not false. Right? And so essentially that's why European civilization works, is our law is based on testimony that is testifiable. In other words,
you refer to it as the uniqueness of the Western civilization.
Yes, it's just for really completely accidental reasons, right? It's geographic and technological and whatever. They developed testimonial truth, which is very basically military reporting. When you go to your officer and you say, you report, you don't opine, you don't fill in the blanks, you just say the facts, right? You testify. That is what our court system is based on, is you're testifying as a military soldier, you're testifying to your fellow peer soldiers what it is. And that's where it comes from. And so instead of being justificationary, truth, the search for truth is falsificationary. And that's why Western law is adversarial. The judge is just a moderator. The jury decides, and you fight, and they decide who wins. It's like gladiators, right? And so it's adversarial law. And so this is because no one can decide. In other words, no one has the authority to decide. Does that make sense? So truth is not what we thought it was. Truth is defined by the competition between excuses and falsifications, leaving only survival. In other words, truth is Darwinian. And so we see the evolution of truth, epistemology, from free association. It doesn't matter how we got the idea, to a basic idea or a hypothesis. You vet the hypothesis. Okay, now let's do an experiment. So that's reason. Let's do an experiment, a theory, and now let's, once it survived the theory, let's put it in the market, and the market will solve it by application. So reason, reason, physical test, in other words, mind, physical test, market. And this is all knowledge follows this process. Mm-hmm. And so the problem, we got stuck in math, right? We thought that, math solves everything. No, it doesn't. It's just for this thing. And so so it took to the 20th century to solve it. So what I did is I said, okay, well, to falsify every dimension possible for man to perceive, what are those dimensions, and how would I have to falsify it? Well, what it means is, if you go through that checklist and your argument survives that checklist, it's not false. It's not. You've done your due diligence. If it's false, turns out to be false, it's not your fault.
Okay.
Right? So you can claim it's true, right? You have made truthful testimony. So we don't have this idea of Platonic or ideal truth, right? It's gone. It's only whether you can say it. Now, it turns out it's really fucking hard to say anything that claim anything is true unless it actually is.
If you go back to the Greek skeptics again.
Yes, it's just really hard. So, and it's really easy to see if you're making shit up. So it's just like the court process. So again, the reason we invented reason and science, reason and rationalism and empiricism and science in this country is just our law. And our law is adversarial because there's no authority. And our knowledge process is adversarial. And that just means it's the same thing as nature. It's trial and error by evolutionary process.